Most people dream of growing up with millions, surrounded by luxury and privilege. But for some young heiresses, that dream came with a dark twist. In today's video, we'll explore the tragic lives of girls who were millionaires from birth, but whose stories took unexpected and often heartbreaking turns. For our first story, we are going back to 1920s New York. Gloria Lauren Vanderbilt was born on the 20th of February 1924 in Manhattan, New York, into a dynasty of massive American wealth and influence. It's reported that after her birth, Gloria's father was heard saying, "It's fantastic how Vanderbilt she looks. See the corner of her eyes, how they turn up?" The Vanderbilts were a large network of families by then, all ultimately descended from Cornelius Vanderbilt, the foremost steamship and railway tycoon in the United States in the middle of the 19th century. Vanderbilt had once quite possibly been the wealthiest man alive, as his trains and ships formed the transport nucleus of the industrialization of America. The family's wealth had been dispersed in subsequent generations, though many signs of the Vanderbilt family were still enormously wealthy. Gloria's father was one of the heirs to this wealth. Reginald Claypool Vanderbilt was a great-grandson of Cornelius Vanderbilt. His older brother Alfred had inherited the majority of their branch of the family's money, but in an age when existing wealth could beget further wealth if invested wisely, Reginald's few $1 million of inheritance still constituted a sizable fortune. Though he ended up squandering a large part of it, spending lavishly on equestrian sports and gambling. He was also an alcoholic, and he died in September 1925 from cirrhosis of the liver when Gloria was just 1.5 years old. Gloria was the only child of Reginald's marriage to Gloria Morgan Vanderbilt. She came from a prominent political family and had married Reginald, who was 24 years older than her in 1923, not long before little Gloria was born. In his will, Reginald left most of his wealth to Gloria Jr. and another daughter he had, Kathleen, from a separate marriage. Reginald left Gloria's mother only a comparatively small allowance, and this would soon become the point of contention in an infamous trial, which Gloria would be central to, while she was still just a child. Despite Reginald Vanderbilt's irresponsibility and poor business acumen, the estate which Gloria and her half-sister inherited was still worth about $5 million, a very sizable sum in the 1920s, worth approximately $100 million in today's money. This was held in trust for Gloria, and the money was to be administered during her younger years by her mother. However, in the course of the late 1920s and early 1930s, and particularly so after the Wall Street crash and the inception of the Great Depression, Gloria's aunt, her father's sister, Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney, began to scrutinize how Gloria's mother was spending this money. This escalated in the early 1930s as Gertrude began questioning whether Gloria's mother was fit on any level to parent her. There was a legitimate case here. Gloria Sr. had spent much of the second half of the 1920s living the high life in Paris, London and Biarritz, and had often left her daughter with family members for protracted periods of time in New York while she swanned around Europe. It was in this context that Gertrude Vanderbilt pressed legal charges against Gloria's mother in 1934 to obtain custody of Gloria. What was dubbed the trial of the century at the time was really just a custody battle, though it also focused on whether or not Gloria's mother had mismanaged her daughter's inheritance. The trial was scandalous. Newspapers reported on the salacious revelations for weeks as evidence of a lesbian relationship Gloria's mother had been involved in surfaced. On one occasion, a maid who had worked for Gloria's mother testified for 5 hours in a manner which depicted Gloria Sr. as what one publication at the time termed, quote, a cocktail-crazed dancing mother, a devotee of sex erotica, and the mistress of a German prince. Unsurprisingly, Gloria herself ended up being described as a poor little rich girl by the media, the 10-year-old heiress who had lost her father and been effectively abandoned by her neglectful mother. Meanwhile, in an effort to manage the media circus in and around the court, the judge ordered that the court be emptied of nearly all attendees in order for 10-year-old Gloria to testify. When the result came down, it was a negative one for Gloria's mother. She was deemed to have been a neglectful mother, and custody of her was granted to Gertrude, as was the responsibility of managing her inheritance, although an allowance was maintained for Gloria Sr. Her mother was allowed visits on weekends, and would appeal the result in 1936, but she was unsuccessful in doing so, and the relationship between mother and daughter never fully healed. In 1946, when she was in her early 20s and had acquired full control over her finances, Gloria stopped paying the $21,000 allowance which her mother received annually, saying her mother could work for a living and that she would henceforth be donating the $21,000 to various charities every year. From the 1940s until her death, Gloria's mother would live with her sister, Thelma Furness, Viscountess Furness, in New York City and Los Angeles. Gloria Sr. eventually died from cancer in 1965. As Gloria grew up after the trial, she attended numerous schools in New York and the wider East Coast of the United States. Initially, this was at the prestigious Greenvale School on Long Island, followed by a stint at Miss Porter's School in Farmington, Connecticut, a girls' preparatory school, which has been attended over the years by the daughters of America's leading business and political dynasties. An increasingly attractive young woman, she was also modeling by her late teens, though her full foray into the world of fashion would only come decades later. By age 17, tiring of the rigidity of life under her aunt, she struck out on her own and went to live in Hollywood in California. These late teenage years saw her endeavor to begin a career in the arts, attending the Art Student League in New York City for a time, and then working both as a visual artist and as an actress, the latter in part motivating her decision to move out west to Los Angeles in the early 1940s. This interest would continue over the years, and in the 1950s and 1960s, she appeared in numerous Broadway productions, as well as several well-known television shows of the time, such as The Love Boat and The Time of Your Life. Gloria's arrival in Hollywood soon resulted in her first marriage. This was to Pat DeCicco, a Hollywood talent agent who was in his early 30s. She was just 17 when they married. The marriage was abusive, and Gloria later stated that DeCicco had left her repeatedly with black eyes and psychologically belittled her. She divorced him in 1945. However, the union had done lasting damage to her relationship with her aunt Gertrude. She disapproved of him from the start, and as Gloria married him anyway, Gertrude cut her out of her share of the Vanderbilt wealth in her will. She died in 1942, just a year after the marriage. A day after divorcing DeCicco, Gloria married the 63-year-old conductor, Leopold Stokowski. It was a happier union than her first, despite him being 3 times her age at the time of their marriage. It lasted 10 years and resulted in 2 children, sons called Leopold Stanislas and Christopher, born in 1950 and 1952. Again, Gloria did not remain single for long after her second divorce in 1955. Just a year later, she married Sidney Lumet. He was the same age as Gloria, and they had quite similar interests, as he was a Broadway director and she was an aspiring actress. The following year, his immensely successful career as a director commenced, with the release of 12 Angry Men, one of the greatest films of all time. The marriage did not result in any children, and ended in 1963, presumably the result of infidelities, as both of them were married again within a matter of weeks. Gloria's fourth and final husband was Wyatt Emery Cooper, another screenwriter and actor. They would remain married until his death during open-heart surgery in 1978. They had 2 children together, Carter and Anderson, born in 1965 and 1967 respectively. While these are the details of her 4 marriages, Gloria had numerous other relationships with prominent individuals over the years, many of them affairs, while she was otherwise married. These include the relationships with the actor Marlon Brando, the singer and actor Frank Sinatra, the inventor and mogul Howard Hughes, and a reputed affair with the children's writer Roald Dahl. While she had set out to be an actress in the 1940s and 1950s, Gloria is primarily remembered today for her fashion career. In the 1970s, she collaborated with Mohan Morangi of the Morangi Group to launch a line of jeans bearing her name. The line was successful, and in the years that followed was expanded out into a range of other clothing and accessories, including dresses, blouses, shoes, leather bags, and other items. This continued to expand over the years, and by the 2000s also involved a range of successful fragrances. All of these endeavours were lucrative, catching the changing trends of women's fashion, and so Gloria managed to establish herself as a successful businesswoman between the 1970s and the 2000s. Gloria Vanderbilt's later life was more settled and less chaotic in many ways than her earlier life had been. She certainly had a less dramatic love life, and she did not marry again after her 4th husband died in 1978. She developed new interests in the 1980s and 1990s. One was renewed interest in a career as a visual artist. Back in the late 1960s, some of her earlier work had been used to develop a range of cards by Hallmark, and in the 1990s, she began working again in glass paint and pottery. The result was a series of shows, most of which were held in the 2000s, in various exhibition spaces on the East Coast, while she also took up a role as a philanthropist in this respect, acting as a critic at various shows and competitions. However, Gloria's great love in her later life was writing. Between the 1970s and her death, she published half a dozen memoirs, documenting various aspects of her life up to that time, notably reflecting on the trial involving her mother and aunt back in 1934, and another on her marriages and relationships over the years. She also published 3 fiction novels: Never Say Goodbye, published in 1989, The Memory Book of Star Faithful, published in 1994, and Obsession, an erotic tale, published in 2009. There was also a growing interest in writing about her, notably through the appearance of Barbara Goldsmith's book, Little Gloria, in 1980, a work examining the trial in 1934 and the cultural context in which it occurred. Gloria Vanderbilt died at home in Manhattan on the 17th of June 2019. The apparent cause of her death was stomach cancer, though she was 95 years of age by then and had lived a long and productive life. She was laid to rest in the Vanderbilt family crypt on Staten Island. Next, we are looking into a reclusive heiress who led a life of distrust, health issues and other problems that few would wish on their worst enemy. Huguette Marcel Clark was born on the 9th of June 1906 in the city of Paris in France. Huguette was the second eldest daughter of William A. Clark, while her mother was Anna Eugenia Clark, William's second wife. Her father, who was nearing his 70th year at the time of Huguette's birth, was a leading figure of American life in the early 20th century. He had earned a fortune during the westward expansion of the United States into Montana and other regions from the 1860s onwards, and had then used the money earned to diversify into railway construction during the railroad boom. From there he had moved into politics, becoming a senator for Montana in the 1890s. Accordingly, Huguette was born into one of the richest and most powerful families in late Gilded Age America. Huguette spent her early life living in Paris, as the Clarks associated with some of Europe's high society. For instance, in 1911, she was present with her family at the coronation of King George V of Britain. She was, though, soon sent back to America to be educated at the Spence School, an all-girls private school in Manhattan, New York, in the early 1910s. Here, she resided along with several other members of her family at the Fifth Avenue house, an enormous 6-story, 121-room building, which was believed to be the largest single-ownership house in New York City at the time. When she was born in 1906, Huguette had many siblings and half-siblings. Her father had 7 children from his first marriage, and though 2 of these had died in infancy, 5 lived beyond childhood, although another, Paul Clark, died in his late teens in 1896. Thus, Huguette had 4 half-siblings, Mary, Charles, Catherine and William, each of whom were approximately 30 to 40 years older than her. In addition, Huguette had 1 full-blood sibling, a sister Andrée, who was born 4 years before her, but who died young as well from meningitis in 1919. The familial arrangement was significant, for the patriarch of the family was aging, and his fortune would soon be inherited by his children. This fortune was very considerable, for Clark had continued to develop his business interests, expanding in the 1900s and 1910s into additional mining operations and in the development of Las Vegas in its early days as a stop-off point for travelers on the way out to Los Angeles. Thus, when he eventually did die on the 2nd of March 1925 in New York City, his wealth was estimated to be approximately $300 million. Adjusted for inflation, this would be the equivalent of over $5 billion today. Thus, Clark's children stood to inherit vast riches when he passed away. Huguette certainly did not follow her father into either business or politics once she had acquired her share of his estate following his death in the spring of 1925. This is believed to have been in the region of $50 million, as her father split his fortune roughly equally between his wife and 5 living children. Huguette was content to engage in philanthropy and develop her interests in the world of the arts and fashion. For instance, in the late 1920s, she spent some $50,000 on having a saltwater pond drained at her villa Belos Guardo in Santa Barbara in California for use as a bird refuge, one which she named the Andrée Clark Bird Refuge in honor of her sister, who had died a decade earlier. Clark had ended up living briefly out in Santa Barbara after marrying one William MacDonald Glover, a law student whom she had met in New York while they were both studying. They were wed in August 1928, but the union did not last long, and they divorced a week short of their first wedding anniversary. Thus, she soon headed back to New York and installed herself in an apartment on Fifth Avenue. Here, her aesthetic senses were soon being put on display. Huguette converted the apartment and adjoining ones to create a huge open space, which looked out over Central Park in a vast chamber replete with a library and other amenities. Throughout the 1930s, Huguette engaged somewhat with East Coast society, displaying some of her paintings in a show at the Corcoran Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C., and attending fashion shows in New York. However, her circle of close friends was small, and to those others who knew her during these years, she appeared elusive and taciturn. As the years passed, Huguette became more and more reclusive. She continued to spend money, but often on initiatives which she never visited or to which she donated anonymously. For instance, a mansion was built by the bird refuge out in Santa Barbara during the 1930s, and Huguette continued to pay tens of thousands of dollars every month to maintain everything there, but she very rarely visited. This reclusiveness intensified following the death of Huguette's mother in 1963, with whom she had lived in New York for most of her adult life. Thus, for much of the 1960s and 1970s, she gradually became an ever more distant figure within New York. Much of this was owing to an increasing distrust of strangers. Huguette had never remarried and had no children, so she began to view everyone in her later years as someone who was potentially trying to inveigle their way into her good graces to benefit from her will. She may not have been entirely incorrect in such a concern, but her methods were paranoid in the extreme. For instance, she increasingly preferred to speak in French to hide what she was saying from those around her. By the late 1980s, Huguette had become an almost mythical figure in New York, almost never seen or heard from, and then in such a limited way that many people believed that she was actually dead, a not inconceivable situation given that she was 80 years old in 1986. Nevertheless, Huguette was alive, though hardly well. By the late 1980s, she had become very frail and was suffering from numerous ailments, the worst being the presence of cancerous lesions on her face which had left her disfigured. Huguette had refused to seek treatment for her conditions, an eventuality which would have forced her to leave her apartment for a prolonged period to visit a hospital, but by 1991 the situation was such that there were no other options. Thus that spring, she was admitted to the Doctors' Hospital of the Upper East Side in Manhattan. There, her physicians gave a sobering account of her condition. Huguette's face had to be operated on and reconstructed. Such was the damage done to it by her refusal to have the lesions treated. Indeed, she had not been to a doctor in 2 decades, and it looked as though she rarely if ever ate. Also, her mental condition was very poor, often seeming as though she was unaware of her surroundings and those that were conversing with her. Following her surgery and recovery, Clark's doctors advised that she could head home to her apartment, but Huguette had taken to her surroundings. Accordingly, she began paying the Doctors' Hospital nearly $1,000 per day for her to be allowed to stay in her hospital room. After, she was moved to Beth Israel Medical Center, and she took up an 11th room floor there, overlooking Central Park, and began paying private nursing staff to care for her. As a result, Huguette Clark would spend the last 20 years of her life living in hospital, but with effectively her own semi-private wing overlooking the park. Her apartment had towered over for half a century, and curiously enough, the change of surroundings seems to have done her well. Over the years, her health and mental state improved considerably, as noted by her physicians in intermittent reports, though she remained highly eccentric nonetheless. What was curious about all of this is that Huguette did not bother to check in with any of her large number of staff members from her apartment on Fifth Avenue, the estate out in Santa Barbara in California, or a mansion she had bought back in the 1950s in Connecticut, but never actually lived in. In these various residences, staff members continued to receive their pay and continued about their work in maintaining the properties, but they had no idea where their employer was, or what had happened to her. Meanwhile, Huguette was hard at work spending most of her vast fortune before she died. Lavish sums were given in gift to individuals. A close lifelong friend of hers received $10 million. This may have been above board, but the fact that one of Huguette's private nurses at Beth Israel Medical Center, Hadassah Perry, received over $30 million in cash bequeaths and gifts seems like some element of exploitation was occurring. Then again, Huguette was a difficult woman not to get gifts from in her later years. On one occasion, she gave the repairman who fixed her television in her hospital room $25,000. Huguette finally died on the 24th of May 2011 at the age of 104. There was an immediate controversy surrounding her wealth and estate. For instance, it was revealed that Huguette had owned several very valuable paintings by numerous famed 19th and early 20th century French Impressionist painters, such as Edgar Degas and Claude Monet. Some of these had disappeared from her mansions in the years that she was residing in hospital. However, the greatest controversy surrounding Huguette's will was the dispersal of the $300 million fortune which she possessed at the time of her death. Originally, a will was presented in court which demonstrated that Huguette had wished to give away approximately 3/4 of her fortune to various charities. Some $30 million was then reserved for her private nurse, Hadassah Perry, on top of the $30 million or so of gifts and money which Uget had granted her when she was still alive. Other stipulations allowed for a bequest to her goddaughter, Wanda Steicher, and cash payments to some of her longtime servants in her apartment on Fifth Avenue. But it was soon revealed that prior to the finalization of this will, Uget had actually signed off on another will altogether just weeks earlier. This had been enormously different to the second will, which was finally certified. The first will had allowed for Uget to bequeath most of her fortune to her extended family. By 2011, most of these were grandnephews and grandnieces, or even more distant relatives, some of whom Uget had never met, and many of the older members of which she had not seen since the 1950s. Nevertheless, Uget had at least temporarily toyed with the idea of granting away the vast majority of her estate to them. When it was revealed that there had been a first will which was quickly changed to disinherit her extended family, Uget's relatives appealed to the courts. Their arguments were obvious. Uget had been an extremely old woman of a questionable psychological state, and they believed her private nurse and others had coerced her in her final weeks into changing her will to make themselves the benefactors and to disinherit them. It is plausible that this was true, though it is equally plausible that Uget simply decided to reward those people to whom she had been closest in her last 20 years. Whatever the truth of it, the judge decided that the family's argument was solid. Thus, Uget's first will was effectively implemented, with the family receiving upwards of 75% of the entire estate. Uget's private nurse, Hadassah Perry, was forced to return the $30 million that she had received as part of the will settlement, though on the provision that her receipt of a similar sum in gifts and other bequests over the years while Uget was still alive would not be challenged. Thus, the Clark family ended up being the major benefactors of her will, though we will never know for sure exactly who the mysterious Uget Clark had actually intended her wealth to descend to. She herself was entombed in the family mausoleum in the Bronx, New York City, while several of the artworks she collected during her lifetime are found in major museums and galleries today. You may think that being one of the wealthiest people in the world would set you up for a great life, but this next story of neglect, failed relationships, and excess shows this isn't always the case. Barbara Woolworth Hutton was born in New York City on the 14th of November 1912. Her father was Franklin Laws Hutton, a wealthy co-owner and founder of E.F. Hutton & Company, a New York-based investment banking and financial company. However, while her father was successful in his own right, Barbara's future wealth would ascend to her through her mother, Edna Woolworth. Edna Woolworth was one of 3 children of the American businessman Frank Winfield Woolworth. In the late 19th century, Frank Woolworth had made an enormous amount of money after pioneering the concept of 5 and dime shops, retail stores in which everything generally was priced at 5 or 10 cents, the forerunner of the modern-day dollar or pound shop. Woolworth's idea was enormously successful, and just months after Barbara was born, he opened the Woolworth Building in New York, the company headquarters, which cost $13.5 million to build, and which was the tallest building in the world until 1930. Despite her family's wealth, Barbara's childhood was very troubled. Her father was a serial philanderer, engaging in a string of extramarital affairs, and he was not exactly discreet in these. Moreover, he was also a neglectful father and a heavy drinker. Thus, when Barbara's mother died suddenly on the 2nd of May 1917, at just 33 years of age, many people suspected that she had taken her own life. The coroner's report officially stated that she had died from suffocation brought on by mastoiditis, a serious infection of the ear, nose and throat system, but the fact that an autopsy was never performed led many to doubt the veracity of this. Her mother's passing was especially cruel for Barbara, as it was she who had found her mother's lifeless body. She had only been 5 years old, but the memory surely stayed with her. Thereafter, Her father effectively sent her off to be raised by a governess and to attend a series of private schools in New York and in Farmington, Connecticut. In the years that followed, events occurred which would shape the rest of her life. In 1919, her maternal grandfather, the founder of Woolworths, died, and then in 1924, her maternal grandmother also passed. As the only child of Edna Woolworth, Barbara now inherited the 1/3 of the Woolworth estate, which would have descended to her mother. This amounted to nearly $30 million at the time, a sum equal to over $500 million in today's money. Barbara did not have access to this money immediately, given her youth, and her father invested it well enough on her behalf that when she finally acquired direct control over it in the early 1930s, the value of it exceeded $50 million, a sum in excess of $1 billion today. By the time she acquired this vast estate, Barbara had already acquired a reputation within American high society, and not a good one. In late 1929, the Wall Street Stock Exchange had taken enormous losses after the economic boom of the 1920s. In the months that followed, the American and world economy drifted into the Great Depression, as many lost their savings, and millions of Americans ended up out of work. It was thus viewed as socially toxic when Barbara's family held an ostentatious debutante ball for her in New York, on the occasion of her 18th birthday in November 1930, one which included guest singing by Rudy Vallee, one of the leading entertainers of the day, and cost over $60,000, a sum equivalent to over $1 million in modern terms. This was incredibly inappropriate given that financiers such as the Huttons were largely seen as having caused much of the country's economic woes, and Barbara was savagely attacked in the press as a result. They referred to her as the poor little rich girl, a reference to her great fortune and also her troubled family background. It was a moniker which would characterize much of her adult life as well. Barbara Hutton's life is perhaps most memorable for her many marriages, 7 in all. The first of these was entered into when she was just 20 years of age and was to Alexiv Midavani. He was the scion of a Georgian family which had fled from the Caucasus in the early 1920s, claiming they were being persecuted by the Soviet authorities there. The family were social climbers, and when he met Barbara, Alexis was already married to Louise Van Allen, a member of the wealthy Astor family. He quickly divorced her to marry Barbara, who was wealthier, on the 22nd of June 1933. As one might have expected from such a figure, he immediately began spending vast amounts of Barbara's money, on top of the $1 million dowry that had been provided to the Midavani family as part of the union. By the time Barbara realized exactly what was afoot and divorced him in the summer of 1935, she had lost a considerable amount of money. Barbara's second marriage was even less successful. This was to Kurt Horgvitz Reventlow, a minor Danish noble. They were married just weeks after her split from Alexis, but the marriage soon deteriorated. He was both physically and emotionally abusive, a situation which led Barbara to begin drinking heavily and taking drugs, habits which she would never kick. She also developed anorexia during their 3-year marriage. Her relationship with Kurt was complicated by their having a child, a boy called Lance, who was born in 1937 and who would be Barbara's only child. It has been speculated that Barbara's anorexia was calculated to ensure that she could not have another child, and indeed, it did result in her inability to become pregnant. However, there is no doubting that she bore some affection towards her son Lance. She successfully contested with Kurt to have custody of him when they divorced in 1938, and while she did send him to be raised by a governess and at private boarding schools, this was simply reflective of her own upbringing and hardly unusual for American high society of the 1930s. While her marriage to Kurt had been a dreadful experience, Barbara entered into a slightly happier time in her life in the years that followed. When the Second World War broke out in September 1939, she became an active fundraiser for the cause in America, a country which was sympathetic towards the plight of Britain, France, and the other victims of Nazi aggression in Europe, but which was unwilling to enter the war in its earlier years. Hutton provided funding and actively campaigned for further aid to the Free French after France was conquered in the summer of 1940. By this time she had moved to California and was using her profile to actively sell war bonds once the US entered the war after the attack on Pearl Harbor in Hawaii in December 1941. It was while she was here that her relationship with the actor Cary Grant intensified. Barbara had met the star of Bringing Up Baby, His Girl Friday, and The Philadelphia Story some years earlier through their mutual acquaintance, the millionaire and philanthropist Howard Hughes. They married in July 1942, and they were mockingly nicknamed Cash and Carey by the media. The union was one of her happier ones, though it too did not last long, and they divorced in 1945. However, Grant never tried to acquire any of Barbara's money, and they both claimed that they remained close friends long after their divorce. After her marriage to Grant ended, and with the Second World War over, Hutton moved to Europe for several years. There she married Prince Igor Trubetskoy, a French aristocrat and athlete of Russian descent in 1947. He used Barbara's money to aid in his efforts to become one of Europe's leading race car drivers, as professional car racing was entering its first golden age in the late 1940s. The union, as with all of Barbara's, ended just after a few years when they divorced in 1951. She did not respond well to this, and the collapse of her fourth marriage, combined with her spiraling drug and alcohol abuse and anorexia, led Barbara to attempt to take her own life. What was worse, news of this leaked out to the media in the early 1950s, and Barbara Hutton was once again reported on in the US and European media as the poor little rich girl, over 20 years after first acquiring that moniker. In December 1953, Barbara stumbled into her fifth and briefest marriage. This was with Porfirio Rubirosa, a diplomat and playboy from the Dominican Republic. It was perhaps Barbara's most unusual relationship. Porfirio had previously been married to Doris Duke, an American heiress of the Duke tobacco family fortune. Doris and Barbara had been born within days of each other in 1912, were two of the wealthiest women in the world, and had developed a curious rivalry over the years. She had married Rubirosa in 1947, but the marriage ended after a brief time, with Rubirosa acquiring an enormous financial settlement in the divorce proceedings. Now, Barbara seemed to be adding salt to the wound by marrying her rival's ex-husband. The view that it was a sham marriage would certainly be suggested by how long it lasted, or didn't last, as the case may be. Hutton and Rubirosa divorced after just 53 days. He once again walked away with a large settlement. Bizarrely, Rubirosa acquired a converted B-25 bomber plane in his divorce settlement from both Duke and Hutton. Barbara would marry two further times. Her sixth marriage was to Baron Gottfried Alexander von Kram, a professional German tennis player whom she had known for some years and who had won the French Open twice in the 1930s. They wed in 1955 and divorced in 1959. After that, Barbara married just once more, to Prince Raymond Duan Vinhana Champasak, a Lao aristocrat. Their marriage lasted just over a year in the mid-1960s. Barbara's seventh marriage was her last. By the time it ended in the mid-1960s, her life was taking on a tragic appearance. Her alcohol and drug problems combined with her anorexia had resulted in many health problems by the time she reached her 50s, while her lavish spending and divorce settlements had resulted in a huge proportion of her vast wealth being spent, stolen or squandered over the years. Much of this was also owing to her own great generosity. Friends and acquaintances always knew she would listen to their requests for financial support for one endeavour or another, but this left a woman who was frequently intoxicated, also open to exploitation. This tragic later life was compounded in 1972, when her only child Lance, from her second marriage, was killed in an air accident in his mid-30s. After this, Barbara became increasingly reclusive. She sold some of her homes to try and stabilize her finances, and moved into the penthouse of the Beverly Wilshire Hotel in Los Angeles in the mid-1970s. It was here that she lived out the last period of her life, addicted to painkillers and alcohol, and nearly blind. She died of a heart attack there on the 11th of May 1979, at 66 years of age. At the time, it was widely believed that she had just $3,500 left in her name, having been one of the world's richest women a half a century earlier, though it is unclear what wealth she actually possessed, if her assets were included. In any event, it was a tragic end to the life of America's prominent poor little rich girl. Now we're heading to 1950s New York to uncover the story of a billionaire heiress whose family seemed haunted by misfortune and who some believed was cursed. Christina Onassis was born on the 11th of December 1950 at Leroy Sanitarium, later known as Leroy Hospital, in New York City. Her father was Aristotle Onassis and her mother was Tina Onassis Livanos. She was their second and last child, an older brother Alexander having been born 2.5 years before Christina arrived. In order to understand the trajectory of Christina Onassis' life, we need to have an understanding of who her parents were and the wealth they attained. Aristotle Onassis, her father, came from a somewhat humble background, but his father in turn was a successful self-made man. Aristotle was born in Smyrna on the east coast of Turkey in 1906. Onassis was of Greek descent, a not uncommon ethnicity amongst the population of Smyrna at the time. Later, when Greece went to war with Turkey following the First World War, Aristotle left Turkey for Argentina. There he began his ascent as a business magnate, moving into tobacco and freight transport, before making a lot of money during the Second World War. He then expanded into the burgeoning airline and casino industries after the war, while also becoming the world's largest shipping magnate. Ironically, Onassis' marriage to Christina's mother Tina was a union with a daughter of one of his greatest rivals. This was Stavros G. Livanos, the owner of the Livanos shipping empire, and one of the few companies that could challenge Onassis' dominance of the Mediterranean freight industry. Tina was just 17 when she married the 40-year-old Onassis in 1946. What this all meant was that Christina was born into an extremely wealthy business dynasty, one which continued to expand as she grew up, with her father cultivating new business ties in Saudi Arabia and its growing oil production ventures. Yet, there was controversy as well. Christina would have been well aware of her father's infamous tax affairs, which were dubious and involved his ships flying under Panamanian and Liberian flags to avoid paying tax and customs duties. Christina had an internationalist childhood. Her father had business dealings all over the world, and the family had homes and bases on 3 continents and many countries, such as Greece, Argentina, the US, France and England. As a consequence, they moved around a lot, and Christina did not have an education in just one country. She was also mainly looked after by servants, not getting much notice from her parents, who were busy with their business dealings, something typical of the children of extremely wealthy families. From the beginning of her teenage years, she was sent to England, where she attended Headington School, an elite independent girls' school, and then Queen's College in London in the late 1960s. These were tumultuous years for her family life. Her father had been over twice Christina's mother's age when they married, and the marriage was rocky through the 1950s, primarily owing to Aristotle's long-running affair with Maria Callas, a famous Greek-American singer. Eventually, her parents divorced in 1960. Further attention was brought to the family when Christina's father began a relationship in the mid-1960s with Jackie Kennedy, the widow of the assassinated president John F. Kennedy. They eventually married on the 19th of October 1968, with the union generating enormous press interest, given the Kennedys' celebrity in the 1960s. Neither Christina nor Alexander warmed to the stepmother, and they resented the increased security arrangements and media intervention in their lives as a result of the relationship and subsequent marriage. Christina always believed that Jackie was interested in her father for his money, and referred to her as, quote, "my father's unfortunate obsession." In the first weeks of 1973, when Christina was 22 years old, an event occurred which would shape the remainder of her life. Her brother Alexander had developed an interest in flying as a hobby in the late 1960s. He had flown thousands of hours and had a pilot's license. He was even president of one of the regional subsidiaries of the family airline business, Olympic Aviation. One catch was that Alexander's eyesight was not particularly good, though this may not have been directly responsible for the tragedy which occurred in January 1973. On the 22nd of January that late winter, Alexander took out his small amphibious plane, a Piaggio P136, to give a lesson to a prospective new pilot for the airline. Alexander sat in the right seat, while the new pilot Donald McCusker, who was flying the plane, was sat in the left-hand seat. A third pilot, Donald McGregor, sat in the back. Tragically, the flight resulted in a bad crash as they took off from Hellinikon International Airport in Athens, owing to some tangled cables. The right wing dipped soon after takeoff, and the plane crashed, with Alexander taking the brunt of the impact. He was badly hurt and was effectively on life support hours later. He died the following day after it was concluded that there was no possibility of saving him. He was just 24 years old. The new potential pilot McCusker and Alexander's regular pilot McGregor both suffered serious injuries, but survived. Alexander's death made Christina the heir to the family business and her father's enormous wealth. He took steps to now begin training her as his successor, though his mind was distracted at the same time. Aristotle became paranoid and convinced that his son's death had been owing to some foul play, blaming McCusker first and then concluding that the CIA had been behind the accident and were out to get him in retribution for his relationship with Jackie Kennedy. As he set about offering large rewards to anyone that could confirm his delusions, Christina headed to New York to begin acclimatizing to the role which she had believed all her life Alexander would eventually play in the business. The next 2 years saw concurrent tragedies. We have already seen that Christina's father took the death of Alexander very badly. So too did her mother. Tina had remarried twice since divorcing Aristotle. She had also developed an increasing problem with prescription medications, and this escalated following Alexander's death. On the 10th of October 1974, while staying in the Paris mansion she shared with her third husband, she suffered an overdose and died from a buildup of fluid in her lungs. Many people at the time and since have speculated that this was a suicide in despair following her son's death the previous year. Christina's final direct family member died just 6 months later. Her father had been suffering from myasthenia gravis, a muscular disorder, for several years. However, after Alexander's death, he stopped combating the condition, and the will to live seemed to have gone out of him. He died on the 15th of March 1975 in a Parisian hospital, supposedly from respiratory failure. With this, Christina had lost both her parents and her only sibling, all within the space of less than 26 months. These tragic circumstances prompted her to state, "I am all alone in the world now." With her father's death, a vast proportion of the Onassis family wealth and business was inherited by Christina. Approximately 45% of the estate was ruled by her father for the setting up of the Alexander Onassis Public Benefit Foundation, a charitable entity established in the memory of Alexander, but Christina inherited most of the other 55%, while she also successfully petitioned for the inheritance of some of the considerable fortune her mother had acquired as part of her parents' divorce back in 1960. With these, she was now a massively wealthy woman, with an estate of somewhere near $600 million, around $3 billion today, and in charge of a business empire. Christina almost immediately decided to reduce the burden of running the business by selling off substantial parts of it. By the mid-1970s, the Onassis business had expanded to freight shipping, transport, airlines, gambling, oil, and many other ventures besides. She sold some parts of it and donated other parts of the business and properties to charitable endeavors. Meanwhile, she consolidated her ownership of the core shipping and airline business, though there has been considerable speculation ever since as to how much of a role she actually played in the running of the day-to-day affairs of the business. The general impression is that the ins and outs were left to the board and directors of the company. During this time, Christina received extensive media attention for her personal life and lavish lifestyle. She lived in almost unheard of luxury, even spending tens of thousands of dollars to send a private jet to the US to bring her back Diet Cokes. She was also known to give thousands to busy friends to clear their schedules for her. The press also reported on her unhappy love life, as we will soon see, and her weight problems. Christina was known to frequently use crash diets, which would lead to her losing a lot of weight, but she would put it all back on when she hit a low point. Furthermore, Christina was widely believed to have a growing drug problem, with addictions to prescription drugs such as barbiturates, antidepressants, and tranquilizers. Christina's own marital life and relationships were even more chaotic than her father's. Between 1971 and 1987, she went through no less than 4 marriages and 4 divorces. The first of these was with Joseph Boca. He was a real estate tycoon who was nearing his 50th year, while Christina was only 20 years of age when they married in 1971. It was a youthful fling of sorts for Christina, and one which strangely mirrored her own mother's marriage to Aristotle when she was just a teenager. They quickly realized they were not made for one another and divorced the following year. 3 years later, late in 1975, Christina married Alexandros Andreadis. He was a shipping magnate and heir to a wide-ranging business empire in Greece, which included banking interests. Again, the marriage was short-lived, and after just over a year, they divorced early in 1977. The union might be viewed as Christina trying to distract herself from the tragedy of losing all her family members in the 3 years that preceded it. Christina's third marriage came the following year, this time to Sergei Kozov. Like Andreadis, he was a shipping magnate, though studies since have concluded that Kozov, a Russian, also had close ties to the government of the USSR and may have been a KGB agent. There is a possibility that Kozov furthered the relationship with encouragement of Moscow to inveigle his way into an extremely important business empire in the Western world, at a time when the Cold War was heading back into a period of increased tensions between Russia and the United States. If so, the idea was soon put on ice. They divorced in 1980. After her marriage to Kozov was dissolved, Christina spent the longest period of her adult life unmarried. It was another 4 years before she married her fourth and final husband, Thierry Roussel. Roussel hailed from a prominent French family, which was involved in the pharmaceutical industry and French politics. Unusually amongst Christina's husbands, he was 3 years younger than her. This final marriage of Christina's resulted in her only child, a daughter named Athena after Christina's mother, born in 1985. 2 years later the marriage ended, unsurprisingly, when one considers that Roussel was a serial philanderer and had 2 other children with his mistress during his years married to Onassis. Christina would not marry again. As noted, Onassis had a growing addiction to prescription medication in the 1970s, and this worsened as the years went on, particularly from 1980 onwards, when she was diagnosed as suffering from clinical depression. With a ready access to pliable doctors and prescriptions, her intake increased in the 1980s as she began self-medicating away the scars of a fairly tortured life. On the 19th of November 1988, Christina was found dead in the bathtub. This was at a friend's house in Argentina, a country where she had spent a lot of her later years, having developed ties to the country that was her father's adopted homeland back in the 1920s. There she had sought to escape press scrutiny and was considering moving to permanently to raise Athena. Her death at just 37 years of age was deemed to have been from a heart attack, though there is absolutely no doubt that this was in part owing to her drug abuse, while others have speculated that there was some sinister element involved, given Onassis' huge wealth. Her body was returned to Greece, and she was buried in a family plot alongside her father and brother. Following her death, Onassis' $250 million estate became the subject of intense legal conflicts. Athena was her sole surviving heir, but was still only 3 years old at the time. Therefore, a number of Greek trustees had been appointed to oversee the estate on her behalf. Throughout the 1990s, legal disputes emerged between them and Thierry Roussel, a figure whose business dealings fluctuated enormously, and who often tried to tap his daughter's inheritance to aid in his financial difficulties. She eventually succeeded to the estate on her 18th birthday in early 2003. Christina's sole child is an equestrian show jumper today. For our last tale, we will be joining Briefcase in 1880s New York, where one heiress disappeared without a trace.
Dorothy Harriet Camille Arnold was born in New York City on the 1st of July 1885. Her father was Francis Rose Arnold, a businessman whose family traced its ancestry back to the beginning of European colonization in North America, with one forebear having allegedly arrived to Plymouth Rock on the Mayflower in 1620. His more immediate ancestors had become embedded in New York high society and business, with Francis himself being a partner in F.R. Arnold & Co., an import company which brought luxury goods into America from abroad. This was an era of unprecedented prosperity in the United States, the so-called Gilded Age, and so the Arnold business, which specialised in perfume, flourished, meaning that Dorothy grew up wealthy and in a family which was known around Manhattan. Dorothy's mother was Mary Martha Arnold. Her maiden name was Samuel, and she hailed from a prominent family whose origins lay in British Canada. She and Francis had 3 other children, a son, John, who was older than Dorothy, and another son and daughter, Dan and Marjorie, born in the years after Dorothy. To further add to the family's social status, Dorothy's aunt on her father's side, Harriet, was married to Rufus W. Peckham, a noted lawyer who served as an Associate Justice of the US Supreme Court between 1895 and 1909. All of these connections would ensure that when Dorothy suddenly disappeared many years later, the story attracted significant media attention both in New York and across the country. Dorothy's childhood was along the lines that one would expect of a daughter of a rich businessman in New York. At the height of the Gilded Age, the family lived in a large townhouse on the Upper East Side of Manhattan and had a considerable staff there. Growing up, she attended the elite Veltin School for Girls. This had been founded in 1886 by Louise Veltin as a school in Manhattan for the daughters of the city's wealthier families, with what was, by the standards of the time, a very progressive curriculum for a female school. Here the girls learned subjects such as English literature, Greek and Roman classics and French, but she also studied the science subjects like chemistry and physics. After her time in Veltin, Dorothy headed for Bryn Mawr College in Pennsylvania, leaving New York for the first extended period of time in her life. There she focused on studying literature and developed aspirations to become a writer. She graduated in 1905 when she was 20 years old. Following her graduation, she again lived in her parents' house on the Upper East Side and was often seen at high society events in Manhattan. Yet she retained some ambitions as a writer. After a trip to the family vacation home in the state of Maine in the autumn of 1910, she informed her father that she wanted to get her own apartment in Greenwich Village. This was an area that had already begun to acquire a reputation as a centre of bohemianism and literary activity. In the course of 1909 and 1910, she had also composed several stories with titles like Poinsettia Flames and Lotus Leaves. Yet sadly for Dorothy, her stories had been constantly rejected by the publishers to whom she had sent them. What was worse, her family mocked her literary ambitions, and her father had refused to fund her desire to live in Greenwich Village, informing her that she could just as easily write in the family home as down in Lower Manhattan. These personal setbacks were important for her later story, as we will soon see. On a cold morning on the 12th of December 1910, Dorothy decided to travel downtown from the Arnold family home. Her mother had suggested travelling out with her, but Dorothy told her not to and informed her that she was just going down to Fifth Avenue to get an evening dress for a party, which was being held for her younger sister Marjorie in a few days' time. Dorothy was also heading to Brentano's bookstore to pick up some books. On the day in question, she was observed to have been well dressed, in an expensive coat of blue serge, with fur and a satin bag. These are important points to note, as her expensive clothes would have made her stand out on Manhattan's busy streets and could have made her a target for theft. She was also wearing a very noticeable black velvet hat with 2 blue roses on it. Down on Fifth Avenue and some streets off it, she purchased a number of things, including a box of candy, in a store where the salesgirl recognised her well enough to charge the sale to the family account without even asking her who she was. Outside Brentano's bookshop, Dorothy ran into Gladys King, an acquaintance of the family who was attending Marjorie's party in a few days' time. She handed Dorothy the acceptance notes that she had been intending to post to say that she would attend the party, and noted that it would save on postage. This was at around 2 p.m. in the afternoon. Dorothy mentioned to Gladys that she was about to head back home to the Upper East Side and would probably do so by walking through Central Park. With that, they departed from one another. Gladys King would be the last person to ever speak with Dorothy Arnold that we know. After she said goodbye to Gladys, Dorothy was not seen again by anyone who knew her. She failed to show up for dinner at her family home, and her parents and siblings were immediately concerned. It was not like Dorothy to miss dinner, and if she was running late or had decided to go somewhere, she would always send word ahead to excuse her absence. The Arnold family did not immediately contact the authorities. This was understandable. Few people ring the police straight away when a person goes missing, when it's only for a few hours, and yet they were clearly worried. That evening, phone calls were discreetly made to some of Dorothy's friends to inquire if they had seen her or if she was possibly out visiting them that day. All responded that they hadn't. The Arnolds were anxious at this moment to not let word get out that their daughter had seemingly ran away. This created a situation which led to problems in the weeks that followed. On the night of her disappearance, one of Dorothy's friends that the family had called earlier that evening, named Elsie Henry, had rang the Arnold house at about midnight to see if Dorothy had returned. In response, Dorothy's mother, a woman of a nervous disposition at the best of times, responded that Dorothy had returned home but couldn't speak to Elsie, as she had immediately gone to bed with a headache. This incident led to suspicions in the weeks ahead that the Arnolds knew more about Dorothy's disappearance than they were admitting, though it doesn't appear that this was the case. It got worse in the days that followed. Fearing a media frenzy, given their prominence in New York society, the Arnolds decided not to report Dorothy's disappearance. Instead, they continued to make discreet inquiries to try and determine where she might be, as well as hiring a family friend and lawyer named John Keith to undertake some investigations for them. It seems that at this early juncture, the family believed that Dorothy had absconded in retaliation for their lack of support for her literary ambitions. It was only after agents from the Pinkerton Detective Agency were hired and failed to come up with any leads as to where Dorothy might be that they and Keith convinced Dorothy's parents in mid-January, weeks after Dorothy's initial disappearance, to go to the city police and file a formal missing persons report. A press conference was held in Frances Arnold's office in Manhattan on the 25th of January 1911 to announce the disappearance of his daughter over 6 weeks after she had gone missing. He offered a $1,000 reward for any information which aided in locating her, a sizable sum equivalent to tens of thousands of dollars in today's money. The predicted media frenzy followed, much of it focused on a clandestine relationship which Dorothy had been engaged in for some time prior to her disappearance with George Griscom Jr., the son of a wealthy Pennsylvania businessman. Griscom and Dorothy had got to know each other while she had been studying at Bryn Mawr and had remained in frequent contact since. However, he was holidaying in Italy at the time Dorothy disappeared and stated that he had no knowledge of her whereabouts. Meanwhile, the police continued their investigations. One line of inquiry was whether she had been attacked in Central Park while walking through there, as she had told Gladys King she had intended to do when she met her on Fifth Avenue. Dorothy's father himself seemed to think that this was the most likely explanation and morbidly speculated that his daughter had been killed there and her body had been thrown into the reservoir in the park. Yet police soon dismissed this theory. They noted that the water level of the reservoir in mid-December 1910, when Dorothy had disappeared, had been too low to conceal her body if she had died in that way. The mystery deepened when in early February the Arnolds received a postcard that simply said, "I am safe," and which was signed Dorothy. The handwriting mirrored their daughter's, but a sample of her handwriting had been featured in the New York newspapers as part of the investigation in late January, and it was soon concluded that the postcard was just a cruel joke that had been perpetrated by someone mimicking Dorothy's handwriting. Having dismissed this, the police announced towards the end of February that the investigation was being scaled down. Dorothy had been missing for 75 days at the point they made the announcement, and without any evidence of any kind to suggest what might have happened to her, they could only conclude that she was almost certainly dead. There were numerous supposed sightings and reports of contact with Dorothy in the years that followed. These are often based on speculative claims that a woman resembling her had been seen in New York or somewhere else on the East Coast, but nothing concrete ever came of these alleged sightings. But they continued to arise. As late as 1935, a quarter of a century after Dorothy disappeared, a tip was given to police about a sighting of her on Fifth Avenue, the last place that she had been seen, on the 12th of December 1910. This in itself indicates the manner in which people let their imaginations run away with them when it came to sightings of Dorothy Arnold. After all, she would have been 50 years of age by then, and probably looked unrecognisable from the 25-year-old woman who had disappeared back in 1910. Meanwhile, Dorothy's parents continued to search for her, and before her father died in 1922, he had spent upwards of $250,000 in an effort to find his daughter or discover what had happened to her. There are 3 major theories concerning Dorothy's disappearance today. One is very speculative. It holds that Dorothy was pregnant at the time, most likely with George Griscom's child, and had undergone a makeshift termination that evening, which went wrong, and during which she died. This seemed to be corroborated in 1916, when a convicted felon in Rhode Island, named Edward Glenarris, made sensational claims about how he had been involved in disposing of the young lady's body back in December 1910, but the information he provided about where she was buried was not confirmed on further investigation, and he later retracted his claim. Furthermore, it is highly improbable that Dorothy would have simply planned to stop off somewhere in Manhattan on her way home from Fifth Avenue to have a quick back alley termination before continuing on with her day. The other two scenarios are more likely. Either Dorothy was attacked in Central Park, killed, and her body disposed of in such a way that left no trace, or else, disappointed at her personal circumstances and her stalling literary ambitions, she took her own life. Some of her family members favoured this explanation of her disappearance, as in a letter she wrote to George Griscom, she alluded to suicide, stating, "Well, the short story has come back. McClure's has turned me down. Failure stares me in the face. All I can see ahead is a long road with no turning. Mother will always think an accident has happened." Furthermore, at this point, her relationship with Griscom was going downhill. Both seem plausible, but with no evidence to substantiate either eventuality, it seems we will never know for sure what happened to the American socialite who disappeared without a trace.
Thank you so much everyone for watching this video on these tragic millionaires or poor little rich girls. I hope you found it interesting. Let me know what you thought of their lives down below in the comments, and if you want more videos like this, also let me know down below in the comments. I hope you guys are subscribed and have notifications turned on to get all my videos as soon as I upload them. Anyway, that's all from me, so I'll see all of you in the next Forgotten Life. Thanks.